Page 84 of Walt Disney's Storyland, Ben and Me. If you ever should visit a fair city of Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, likely you will see a fine statue to memory of Benjamin Franklin. He was one of the country's first great leaders. Benjamin Franklin was a philosopher, an inventor, and a patriot. If you are fortunate enough to have a good view of the crown of statues, a broad-brimmed hat, you may see there a tiny statue to one of the country's unsung great, a chap to the name of Amos Mouse. It was Amos, you see. He was really responsible for many of the great deeds cited to Franklin. And there is a story in his own words. I was born and raised in Philadelphia, in the old church on 2nd Street. Our home was in the vestry behind the paneling. There were 26 children in the family. With that many mouths to feed, we were naturally poor. In fact, we were as poor as church mice. Since I was the oldest, I decided to set out into the world and make my own way. If I were successful, I could help the others, but in any case, it left one less mouse to feed. It was the winter of 1745. Those were difficult times. Jobs were scarce, especially for a mouse. All day, I tramped through the snow, dodging in icicles, brooms, and cats. By nightfall, I did not know where to turn. If I didn't find shelter, soon I'd be done for. My last hope was an old, run-down shop near the edge of town. A sign just over the door read, Benjamin Franklin, printer and bookbinder. Somehow that sounded promising, so I found my way inside. The place was full of strange contraptions, brass rods, tangles of wire, and such. It was about as cold inside as out. Back in the shadows sat a round-faced man trying to write by candlelight. As I watched the little man, he began to shiver with cold. Then came a mighty sneeze. Achoo! Off flew his glasses. They crashed on the floor. Oh dear! Don't tell me, cried the little man. My last pair. Now that will do. Now that will I do. I'll never get my paper out. And if I don't pay my rent in 24 hours, the man I owe money will take my press and my fortune and throw me out. 24 hours, I said thoughtfully. It isn't much. It's hopeless, said the little man. But I can't give up. I hold him nothing ventured, nothing gained, Mr. Franklin. My name's Ben, he said. Plain Ben. And what would you do, whatever your name is? My name's Amos, I told him, one of the church mice over the 2nd Street. And the thing I'd do is figure out a way to heat this place. I suggested a firebox in the middle of the room so that heat didn't go up to the chimney. Of course, I had made it of iron with the pipe to the chimney to carry off to the smoke. It sure wasn't much to look at when he got made, but it works, Amos, he had to admit. Say, I wonder if I couldn't make these call them Franklin stoves. If you know our history, of course, you know that I did make those stoves. Well, while Ben had been fooling around with his stove, he'd been at work on his eyeglasses. He'd broken both his outdoors and his reading pair. The only thing left was to make one pair out of two, fitting the glasses together as best he could. Will they do? I asked Benjamin Franklin. When he tried them on, they will do, he echoed. Why, Amos, they're great. Two-way glasses by George Bifocals, we'll call them. And to my surprise, they became famous, too, even more so than the Franklin stoves. If we're ready then to get to work on the paper, and when I took a look at it, I found it really needed work. Poor Richard's Almanac. It was called Poor Indeed. I thought there wasn't a real bit of news in the whole street. What would you suggest, Ben? First, I'd give it a name, something snappy like, the Gazette, the Pennsylvania Gazette. That's what I'd call it. Then I'd give them some news, real news. But where will I get the news at this hour? Ben Franklin wanted to know. So of course I had to go out and get it for him. I found a big fire on Chestnut Street. I came upon some fellows plotting to cheat the city. I filled my pocket notebook full of news. Then I raced back to Benjamin Franklin and helped him set the story of the fire and plot to cheat the city and type and print off the sheets on his hand printing press. It was a long night's work, but I'm here to state it was worth it. By evening of the next day, everyone in Philadelphia was reading the Gazette. Ben Franklin was a success. From then on, I went everywhere with Ben, riding conveniently in his hat so I could lean down and give him pointers now and then. Well, the years went by quickly, and Ben's reputation grew. Letters poured in, letters poured in from all over the colonies, asking Ben's advice on all kinds of things. It took most of my spare time to answer them. Meanwhile, Ben was puttering around with his experiments, and it was one of them that led us at last to the parting of our ways. Ben took up a kite flying. It was the beginning. And to the framework of his largest kite, he fastened a small box just to me. I was so thrilled by flying, seeing the whole countryside spread out like a storybook below, that I failed to notice a sharp-pointed wire fastened to the kite. The first hint I had that anything was wrong was when the sky darkened and thunderclouds and rain wind began to blow. The kite spun and shivered, but Ben would not pull me in. I screamed myself hoarse. I tugged at the rope. Now lightning was flashing along the horizon. Thunder would roll. The storm was moving our way. Suddenly, with a blast that seemed to split the world, lightning struck my kite. The shock went through me and almost tore the kite to ribbons. I thought my end had surely come. Now too late. Ben began to wind his rope, and the kite, and I, in tatters both, came shattering down the wind and landed in a tree. When Ben found us there, he scooped me up in one hand. Amos, speak to me, he cried. I could almost forgive him for what he had suffered. He seemed to be deeply upset. Shakily, I managed to open one eye. Amos, he cried again. Was it electricity? I had been the victim of a plot. All he cared about was whether or not the sizzle in the lightning bolt was the same as electricity. That was the end for me. Goodbye, I said, and thought he pleaded with me to change my mind. I left Ben and then went back to my family. The years that followed were troubled ones. Restless crowds filled the streets. There were riots and loud talk against the stamp tax and other outrages of the king. It was during this crisis that Ben was chosen to go to England and lay our case before the king. The colonies eagerly awaited his return, but Ben's mission was a failure. The king would not listen. It seemed as if war must surely come, but the people had no clear statement of their cause to hold them together through a long, bitter fight. Poor old Ben was worried. I couldn't help but feeling sorry for the little man. It was a heavy responsibility. He had more than he could carry. I could help him. I knew I could, but no, I could not go back to work for Benjamin Franklin. After all, a mouse has his pride. One night in the summer of 1776, I was awakened by a voice calling my name. Who could it be at that hour, I wondered. Sleepily, he staggered out of the bed and through the mouse hole in a vesty paneling. There on his knees was a great man, Ben Franklin himself. Amos, I've come to ask you to come back, he said, as humbly as you please. I was pleased and touched, but I could not let him see it. Out of the question, I said, and turned to go. Please, Amos, consider our country, he begged. I have many big decisions to make, and I can't make them alone. You just must come back, Amos. On my own terms, I asked. If I draw up an agreement, you will sign it. I'll sign it, Amos. I'll sign any agreement you draw up, he vowed. So I went back to having spent the night writing out our agreement by candlelight. Ben was glad to see me the next morning. You may be sure he took my hat and coat. He made some tea, but he was not to be put off my course. I gave him at once my agreement to sign. Of course, he said. Do you mind if I read it? If you wish, I said. That was when the knocking came to the door. It was Thomas Jefferson. Red, Ben called him. It was in the terrible state, you see. He was one of the leaders of the colonies, too. And he was supposed to write for them all the statement of what they believed, a Declaration of Independence. You might say, he could not get a beginning right, struggle as he would. The time has come when we, the people of these colonies, he began to read, but then he broke off and shook his head. No, Ben, this isn't right. The time is at hand. No. Psst, Ben, I said. When I saw how upset the poor Thomas Jefferson was, how about our contract? Shh, said Ben. Just a minute. No, I insisted, now. So Ben got out his magnifying glass and began to read it aloud. When in the course of human events it becomes necessary, Ben cried, Read, Jefferson, perking up, that's it. So that's how it happened that I supplied the beginning for the Declaration of Independence. Oh, I didn't get public credit, of course, but fame doesn't matter to a mouse. I have many memories, wonders of the good old days, and Ben and me.